Hi, I'm Andrew Soren, and today's episode is something a little different. Over the past couple of years, this podcast has featured more than 50 incredible guests, thinkers, researchers, and practitioners who've helped us explore the many sides of meaningful work. I'm grateful for every single one of those conversations. But some of you have told me, hey, Andrew, we love your guests, but we'd like to hear more from you. This is your chance. What you're about to hear is based on a text I've been working on with my mentor, collaborator, and, all around eudaimonic friend, Dr. Ryff. The last piece we wrote together on meaningful work and its implications for health and well-being was what sparked this whole podcast. This new text takes the conversation deeper. We explore work as a polis and what that would mean to the ways that we design our workplaces as moral communities devoted to human flourishing. This piece is about reclaiming the communal soul of eudaimonia. It's about confronting greed, it's about celebrating kindness, and it draws on Aristotle, modern science, and maybe even a little art along the way. I'll also say that many of the ideas from this article come from the 50 plus conversations I've had for this podcast. As you listen, I'd love to hear your reactions. Do these ideas resonate? Do they challenge you? Do you disagree? Do they spark a story from your own work? This episode is as much an invitation to dialogue as it is a talk, because if we want more meaningful work in the world, it's going to take us all imagining it together. So without further ado, here is my talk, Work as Polis, Reclaiming the Communal Soul of Eudaimonia, an episode in 5 acts. Welcome to the Meaningful Work Matters podcast. I'm your host, Andrew Soren, founder of Eudaimonic by Design. On this podcast, we'll dive into the world of meaningful work, explore its complexities, and examine its impact on people and the organizations they're a part of. Each episode features insightful conversations with cutting-edge experts who are successfully navigating the challenges of meaningful work. We hope to offer you ideas, frameworks, and tools to unlock potential and design work that's fulfilling, impactful, and supports everyone's well-being. Subscribe or follow us now, and let's make meaningful work matter. Act 1. Work as a site of eudaimonic possibility. Despite years focused on helping individuals and teams build well-being at work, I'm increasingly convinced that we won't make a dent on eudaimonia in the workplace unless we focus as much on systems as we do on individuals. If you've never heard the term before, eudaimonia is an ancient Aristotelian term for well-being. You can understand it as becoming your best self through virtue and purpose. Now, the other way people tend to talk about well-being is as hedonia, which could be summed up as feeling good or pursuing pleasure. Aristotle explored eudaimonia most in the work that he did on ethics, but he also wrote about it in his work on politics, where he argued that the purpose of a city-state, what he called the polis, is the eudaimonia of its people. In this episode, I'm going to suggest that the modern workplace, in the way that it is scaled and structured, probably has the potential to embody Aristotle's polis even more than our nation states do today. Given the kind of power that our governments seem to be handing over to corporations these days, I'd like to suggest it's really important for organizations to think a little more like Aristotle and use their power wisely for the collective good. What that means is thinking of themselves a little more like a polis, pursuing eudaimonia for their stakeholders as a guiding aim rather than just satisfying the pocketbooks of their shareholders. Now, that may seem naive, and I'm totally okay with that. I don't think all corporations at all remotely will be interested in this idea. But even if there's some, it will make a difference. There's research that says it takes about 23% of a population to start a wave and make systemic change. 23% seems like a good aim to me. Act 2, the communal soul of eudaimonia. Aristotle defined eudaimonia as activity of the soul in accordance with virtue and or excellence. He used the term arete, which could be translated as either. The etymology of the term eudaimonia is useful to understand. Eu means good. Daimon means soul or demon or spirit. In other words, we all have a soul that yearns to do good. According to Aristotle, the goal of a life is to discern and fulfill the calling of eudaimon. Eudaimonia isn't just a feeling. It's not just about thinking. It's not just about willing. It's about striving to do good intentionally and wisely. It's a journey. It's not a destination. It's one marked by struggle, by commitment, by failure, and perhaps most importantly, by ethical discernment. Eudaimonia for Aristotle wasn't a private pursuit. It was the very aim of the polis. A flourishing society supports the conditions where individuals can live eudaimonic lives. The two are totally intertwined into a virtuous cycle. That's what I mean by the communal soul of eudaimonia. We can't pursue our best lives without thinking about others. Our flourishing depends on theirs. Important footnote here. Yes, Aristotle's polis excluded women, slaves, and youth. That exclusion was real, it was problematic, and that's an episode for another day. Now, much of modern psychological science, especially positive psychology, which you heard is a big focus of me, has quietly stepped away from what could be described as the normative foundations that were central to Aristotle's conception of eudaimonia. Rather than grappling with how human beings ought to live, positive psychology tends to focus on describing what well-being is in ways that are measurable and scalable. Scholars like Mohsen Joshimlu, who you may have heard on this podcast, argue that almost all well-being frameworks that we use today, like PERMA or subjective well-being or psychological well-being, are almost all centered on the individual. They're grounded in enlightenment ideals, ones that emphasize personal autonomy, self-expression, individual happiness, values that reflect Western, individualist, and often capitalist worldviews. Another important footnote, if we turn to indigenous, Eastern, or other non-Western traditions like the medicine wheel or Ubuntu or Maori well-being or Confucianism's Ren, so on, we'd find conceptions of well-being that are deeply relational, that are collective, that are ecological. And to date, well-being science has shown relatively little curiosity about these traditions, although I'm glad to report that's definitely starting to change. What this means in practice is that when people talk about well-being in Western, educated, industrialized, rich, democratic places, and especially when we do so in the quote-unquote wellness industry, we often reduce well-being to a project of self-optimization. The goal becomes my best self, not necessarily contributing to the best world. The focus is on self-actualization. It's not transcendence. It's about me. It's almost never about we. Meanwhile, that wellness industry has exploded into a multi-billion-dollar marketplace focused on self-help, self-care, personal growth. You go to an airport and the bookshelves are full of bestsellers, promising to live your best life, usually through individual habits and mindset shifts and productivity hacks. Few of them ask deeper moral questions. Those kinds of questions don't usually sell as many copies to the middle-aged, affluent, educated white women who are mildly depressed, which apparently is the ideal demographic for popular press positive psychology books. This is the context by which virtue has been replaced by excellence and optimization. Ethics has been replaced by outcomes and step counts. The collective has been quietly erased. This is what I mean when I talk about the missing communal soul of well-being science. We've lost sight of the ways in which flourishing is a fundamentally relational and ethical project, not just a psychological one. We don't become eudaimonic in isolation. We become eudaimonic through, with, and for others. Act 3, designing the organizational polis. For Aristotle, the polis was a self-governing community, not for mere survival or commerce, but for enabling lives of virtue, of reason, and shared purpose. It turns out the things that Aristotle thought were really important for a polis are really echoed in research on organizations that are good at fostering eudaimonic well-being. For example, the telos of a polis, its purpose, you could say, is the eudaimonia of its people. Same with many purpose-driven organizations. Their goal is the well-being of all the stakeholders they serve. The polis unites around shared ideals of a common good. Likewise, eudaimonic organizations elevate this collective purpose over and above just shareholder value. In the polis, active citizens rule and are ruled, deliberating together. Likewise, in organizations that foster eudaimonic well-being, agentic voice and choice are critical. Like a polis, these organizations, they understand that before we can get to eudaimonia, we need to make sure that civil liberties are protected. When it comes to work, that means it is about fundamentally decent work first. According to the Industrial Labor Organization of the United Nations, decent work means that workers deserve, 1, equity. They deserve to be paid fairly and have access to opportunity. 2, they need freedom, freedom from harm, but also freedom to innovate, to dissent, to self-direct. 3, they need security. They need to make sure that their jobs are stable and predictable. And 4, they need dignity, a recognition of workers as human beings first, not economic outputs. Now, the polis used rituals and education and leadership to cultivate virtue as a moral community. It's the same thing with eudaimonic workplaces. They do this through participatory governance structures, a focus on psychosocial health, recognition and learning, transparent communication, and practices of organizational justice. It's true that Aristotle also emphasized scale and intimacy. A polis should be small enough for mutual recognition and shared accountability. And for me, this really rings true in practice. Organizations that seem most aligned with eudaimonia tend to be smaller or mid-size, or it's about teams within bigger organizations. Few giant corporations are able to take that long view, but some do. And from my perspective, I think that they deserve our recognition for trying. Act 4, the business case for eudaimonia at work. Now, I've been a management consultant for a while now, and I know better than to try to convince anyone that they should start thinking of their organization as a polis, unless there's actually a strong business case to do so. And fortunately, there is. Much of the current research around eudaimonia at work is dedicated on proving that fostering eudaimonia, fostering well-being in general, leads to measurable outcomes, especially productivity and performance. For example, they might use data to show clear links between eudaimonic well-being and physical health and longevity. There is definitely economic value there. Individuals who have that kind of well-being are less likely to miss work. They'll incur lower long-term healthcare costs. And in these ways, organizations get to save money. And beyond health and just showing up for work, well-being also offers competitive advantage. For example, research by Jan-Emmanuel Deneve at Oxford in partnership with Indeed shows that companies that score high on eudaimonic well-being consistently outperform market indices. Other studies link eudaimonia to increased task performance, to creativity, to initiative, to engagement, loyalty, innovation. Organizations that invest in eudaimonia are more likely to attract and retain top talent. And that top talent will be more inspired. They'll be more committed. So yes, eudaimonia is really good for business, but it feels inherently un-eudaimonic to argue for human flourishing solely in economic terms. That materialistic logic, the idea that dignity and well-being matter only if they boost performance, is the same logic that Alistair McIntyre calls the morally hollow cage of organizational life. It's the logic that reduces people to means rather than ends. The reason why so many workplaces can feel soulless, extractive, and morally adrift. To reclaim work as a polis, we have to reframe eudaimonia, not just as a strategic lever, but as an inherently moral act. It has to be pursued not only because it improves performance, but because it's the right thing to do. This requires a moral realignment of the business case itself. We need to reintegrate virtue ethics, moral inquiry, and human development in the way we think about organizations, not as an alternative to productivity and efficiency, but as a necessary counterbalance to it, not just to prevent harm, but actually to promote flourishing. This is a shift from what could be described as a pathnogenic model, treating illnesses and dysfunctions, what we generally think of when we think of going to a doctor, to a salutogenic one, designing for vitality, growth, and meaning. Beyond any arguments that might appeal to the optimists amongst us, it's imperative to point out that the costs of neglecting well-being are truly staggering. I mean, there's skyrocketing mental illness, burnout, and rising healthcare expenses, and even unnecessary mortality. And that is especially true for 1/3, and I'll say that again, 1/3, 1 out of 3 global workers who do not earn what could be considered a living wage. These are not just economic challenges, they're moral ones. If organizations operate without a moral lens, they risk becoming systems that quietly perpetuate harm to their people, to the planet, and to what I think is the very soul of society itself. Act 5, reclaiming the soul of work. Okay, in the piece that Carol and I are working on, we spend quite a bit of time exploring how we think that artificial intelligence might shape the organizational policy of the future. And for the sake of time in this episode, I'm just going to give you the punchline, which is that it's probably going to leave a lot of people in what David Graeber called a bullshit job, which he described as roles that were so devoid of meaning that they required effort just to pretend like they mattered. Left unchecked, AI is likely to deepen inequality, to displace uniquely human capacities, and to push us further away from the kinds of work that actually nourish eudaimonia. Unless we actively design with ethical intention and practical wisdom, we risk building these systems that will actually hollow out the soul of work completely. How do we counter that? I think that part of the answer is actually in the arts. The arts aren't just some kind of luxury or an escape. They're a foundational element to cultivating eudaimonia in life, period. And I think especially in organizational life. They can offer us a vital alternative to a kind of mechanistic and metrics-driven mindset that seems to dominate most workplaces today. They can foster a reflective, relational, maybe even imaginative capacity, the kind of things that we desperately need right now. The scholar Donna Ladkin has done a bunch of work on the relationship between aesthetics and business ethics. I think that she does a really good job in helping to make this case. When she looks across that literature, she's found a way to synthesize the relationship between aesthetics and business ethics into basically 5 ways that the arts can help expand our capacity to lead and live well at work. For example, 1, they sharpen our perceptual discernment. They help us attune to nuance and complexity. 2, they build a kind of emotional sensitivity that can really help us ground moral decisions in an ethic of care. 3, they stretch our moral imagination, allowing us to envision alternatives and craft new futures. 4, they bring the first 3 together. They integrate intuition and feeling and vision, and that can really do a lot to support eudaimonic agency and action. And then 5th, the arts are really good at inviting critical reflexivity. They prompt us to stop and pause and ask whether we're really living our values. The arts can cultivate the kind of wisdom our moment demands. The integration of moral imagination, aesthetic sensibility, and systemic awareness that I really believe that both leaders and workers alike need to navigate an increasingly complex world. They help us see more clearly. The arts help us feel more deeply. And most importantly, the arts can help us act more wisely. The arts may help us better understand and stop the very forces that might be eroding anything good in the polis. But how do we build this capacity? Well, Aristotle would say through education, but things don't look so rosy there. Around the world, education policy seems to be moving in the opposite direction. And funding for the arts is being cut and replaced by a pure focus on STEM or vocational outcomes. The consequence of that is that we're neglecting the very capacities that make us most human. Things like critical thinking, ethical discernment, emotional depth, character. Ironically, these are also the capacities most threatened by the rise of AI, and the ones most essential to ensuring that AI actually serves human flourishing and doesn't undermine it. There are some efforts to center the arts in organizational development. For example, there are amazing business schools out there that try to integrate poetry and fiction and philosophy into leadership education and try to bring imagination and emotion into systems that are often just obsessed with control. But the reality is those schools are few and far between. We could also leave it in the hands of enlightened CEOs, and there definitely have been. For example, in the early 20th century, the pharmaceutical magnate Albert C. Barnes, who later created the Barnes Foundation in Philadelphia, which, by the way, is a phenomenal museum of art if you've never been, Barnes offered daily seminars in philosophy and art to his factory workers, many of whom were women and African Americans, and it was all in an attempt to try to democratize education, to nurture moral purpose and citizenship within industrial life. But I don't have much faith in leaving this work to CEOs, especially when most of those CEOs have comp structures that rest on maximizing short-term shareholder value. And so if CEOs aren't going to do it, maybe the workers of the world will. There's this brilliant historical investigation that Aristotelian scholar Edith Hall did that shows how working class people across Britain and Ireland for centuries have engaged in self-education around the arts and humanities to help them articulate moral arguments, to demand moral dignity, and to fight for justice. I think that we can also just take a step sideways and see that even when unnoticed, the arts are always already present in how we work. For example, they're designed into the literal architecture of our spaces, the aesthetics of our brands, and perhaps most importantly, in the stories that we tell. Stories are not just communication tools. They're how we make meaning. In the context of the polis, stories have always played a very important role in the collective catharsis of citizens. Aristotle talked about how stories can create wonder and awe, but they also allow us to heal from collective trauma. They're a form of spiritual self-transcendence. They are very much an emphasis on the we. As Angus Fletcher has shown, the stories we tell are kind of like technologies that not only heal us, they can move us into well-being and hope, and optimism, love, curiosity, kindness. In the context of work, stories shape culture. They establish norms, they transmit values, they signal what matters. Stories carry emotional weight, ethical nuance. They help build collective memory. They teach us what's possible, what's permitted, and what's celebrated. Through stories, people learn not only how to do their jobs, but why those jobs matter. They foster connection, they build shared identity, and they cultivate the kind of practical wisdom needed to navigate complexity. In many ways, stories are like the moral infrastructure of an organization. And because they're inherently relational, stories also serve as a vehicle for liberation, a way individuals and groups can reclaim dignity and assert agency and imagine alternatives. When told honestly and when held collectively, stories allow for ethical reflection and maybe even communal healing. I think that to build eudaimonic organizations, we have to start treating storytelling not as a leadership technique for influence and persuasion or personal branding, but as a sacred practice, one that reveals and reinforces a shared sense of purpose and virtue and responsibility. If we want to reclaim the communal soul of work, we should be paying attention to the stories we tell, the stories we reward, and the stories that we allow to be forgotten. In the end, the argument I've tried to make in this episode is hopefully fairly simple. Work has always been more than just what we do to survive. It shapes who we are, how we relate to each other, what kind of society we live in. If we take Aristotle seriously, and I really think there's still good reason to do so, we need to design our systems of work as if eudaimonia mattered. That means looking beyond the language of optimization and performance. It means refusing to treat people as units of productivity. It means asking different kinds of questions, ethical questions, aesthetic ones, even philosophical ones. It also means recognizing that organizations are not just economic machines. They're moral communities. Whether or not we call them a polis, they certainly have that kind of potential. And this isn't a call for idealism. It's an acknowledgement of what's actually already happening in the margins. There are definitely leaders in workplaces trying to do this differently. There are people, probably some of the people who are listening right now, already telling different stories, experimenting with different structures, reclaiming a sense of shared purpose. The challenge is to notice those moments, to name them, to learn from them, and to build on them together. That's certainly my hope for this podcast and for the communities I work in. It's certainly what I believe makes my own work eudaimonic. I'd love to hear your thoughts on this. Does this vision of the workplace as a polis resonate with you? Where have you seen a glimpse of it? I'd love for you to share your stories with me. I'd love to feature some of them in future episodes of Meaningful Work Matters. Thank you, and I'll see you in the next episode. Thank you for joining us for another episode of Meaningful Work Matters. If you haven't already done so, be sure to subscribe to our podcast on your favorite platform. And if this episode resonated with you, please take a moment to leave us a review. Your feedback helps us make this podcast better and reach more listeners. You can connect with me, Andrew Soren, on LinkedIn, or visit www.eubd.ca to learn more about eudaimonic by design. Finally, if what you heard today spoke to you, tell your colleagues and people in your community about our podcast. We really appreciate your support in making meaningful work matter. See you next time.